Okay, hello and welcome to Cambridge Skeptics Live. Cambridge Skeptics are a not-for-profit community organisation which has the mission of promoting skepticism and critical thinking skills in a positive way via public engagement. This evening we are joined by the wonderful people from Cambridge Uni's Students Against Pseudoscience. So I'm going to hand over to them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who they are and what they do.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Chris, and I'm joined here by Inigo and Naomi. So we are Students Against Pseudoscience, and we are a new student-run movement founded at the University of Cambridge to empower young people and future leaders to understand and combat the growing nature of scientific misinformation with compassion and humility. And I think a good way to describe what we do is we educate, advocate, and build bridges across academic disciplines, engage communities, and also link them to professional sectors doing work on the ground as well. Our work so far, you have seen, is that we organize speakers, panels, and workshops through which we facilitate open, respectful, and out-of-the-box discussions on these issues, which we think is crucial. Which is why we're here, I guess. It's really lovely to be speaking with you guys at Cambridge Skeptics, because you guys have been so supportive of us, you know, the whole way since our very beginning, and we're really excited about what we're going to talk about later.
Okay. Indigo or Naomi, do you have anything you want to say before we start dive into the general chat?
Oh, maybe I'll just give a short introduction. I mean, Chris covered most of it, so well done to him. But yeah, I'm Inigo. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Cambridge, and I'm the vice president of the QSAP. So I help organise. We've got quite a few members of our society at the moment in terms of committee. We've got probably about 20-ish. So I help organise them. And I thought I'd also introduce the little fellow behind me. So this is Skepti, the skeptical skunk. So this was, I mean, mainly a product of my boredom over the pandemic, is I thought I'd draw up a little mascot and a logo. And he's been in a couple of our posts spreading misinformation. So that's sort of just been a fun thing I've had going on, really.
Does he spray snake oil salesmen?
No, but that's a great idea. That might become part of the law of Skepti. So far, he's just a sort of anti-vax, anti most things science.
Yeah, it's to come up with a law for Skepti is very much one of our aims at the moment. But no, actually, we should probably have introduced ourselves as people as well. So, Naomi, would you like to give any brief introduction of yourself as well before I
everyone
go?
Yep. I'm Naomi, also part of QSAP. I started as a PhD student in 2020 and was, to say the least, very disappointed about the university's offer of science communication in our basic training program. And that got me thinking, also, of course, in the context of times, that I started about the importance of actually having a student-based initiative on this to unite and actually empower each other. I was actually planning on starting a campaign, and then gladly I found out about QSAP. Otherwise, the campaign would have been called Sci Come On, which is horrible. So I'm really glad I found out about QSAP. And I'm so excited to work with these guys.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we aren't that new, but when Naomi popped up to our Freshers Fest, or we bonded immediately, and we were both jumping with ideas, and it was the best thing ever. So, as I said, I'm Chris. I'm actually a fifth-year medical student, so we all come from quite different academic and also cultural backgrounds. I'm also from Hong Kong, and I think, you know, I've through QSAP, we've met a lot of people with very different personal reasons to be excited about misinformation and its harms and how we can grow and work around them. But my story really involves a lifelong interest in psychology, in the way people think, in neuroscience, in the way in the way these things interact with the information that we absorb, and how, especially more recently, how socio-political events can affect people's trust in different information environments. So all of this added together is why I find myself here. Yeah.
That's great. So the plan this evening is generally to sort of have a discussion about ways of combating pseudoscience. I think all of us have had some sort of involvement in either thinking about that, reading about it, actually doing it ourselves. And so we thought we'd all come together, have a chat, share some ideas, and see where that goes. Does anybody feel like starting? Does anything want an area to start with, or?
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know
it's all. Sorry, Sam.
Sam, go for it.
So I think there's obviously we've talked about, or not we talked, but within ourselves, I think we've talked a little bit about, like, do we go after individuals? Do we go after organizations? Kind of what scale do we work on? And I think within the kind of the individual side of things, there's a bit of a question as to, within that, do we go for who among the individuals do we go for? And something I think we may have talked about before is actually the 10 out of 10 pseudoscientists are kind of untouchable. They're so divorced from reality that you're probably not going to be able to make a dent on them. And they're probably the people that you're going to interact with in the most vehement fashion. But actually, if you're talking to a 10 out of 10, bear in mind that, like, your audience, or maybe there's a concept that actually your audience should be actually the sevens. People who are on the pseudoscience side, they're not diehard believers, they're not absolutely wedded to the idea, but they're uncertain, or your 4 to 7s maybe. They're uncertain, they're kind of in the middle ground, and you don't want to be pushing them towards pseudoscience. You want to be bringing them back towards rationality. And so I think as a concept, that's your target.
I think that's a very good point, Simon. That's something that we've thought about a lot. I think as when we were very newly founded in 2020, because we were midway through COVID, and that's it makes you think about misinformation. Our very first thoughts were very much what most people think we do on first impression, which is very much keyboard warrior, counter-protesting, working with the 10 out of 10s, as you put it. But we very quickly learned, and it is part of our growth, that it's rarely useful telling people they're wrong, and also it's very antagonizing. Also, to get someone to change their mind is, as Angela Saini put it when she came to talk to us about the pseudoscience of race, it's equivalent to probably decades of anti-terrorism philosophy, therapy, for example, and that becomes really difficult to say that's what targeting pseudoscience is about. The way we think about dealing with the 4s to 7s, in a very eloquent way that you've put it, is very much that for those who are undecided about this information or apathetic, very often it is about that first exposure effect. It's about that tipping very early on, and given the same amount of time and effort and resources, doing that with a larger number of people is far more efficable than working with someone who is very much on the other end. And these are very much part of the questions that we want people to think about and talk about, and to get to get these concepts out into the main sphere of understanding of these issues.
I have a follow-up question, which is, on that scale of 1 to 10 that Sam was describing, in your experience, either in your professional lives, attempting to communicate pseudoscience, and also in what you want to do with QSAP, what's the spectrum of people that you feel like you're encountering on that scale from 1 to 10 of pseudoscience belief?
Okay, no, that's a great. I think to answer that question, we actually need to lift back, step back a little bit, and actually talk about what QSAP aims to do and is about, right? So, of course, if you're asking me what kind of people we meet, the people whose minds we're trying to change, which is what people assume that is what we're trying to do at first instance. We're in a higher education space. We meet a lot of people who are already STEM students. It's really not about it's you know, I think anyone, well, yeah, add to that, any academic or any student is at a different level of, you know, that scale from lay to expert. And even if you had a particular interest in a particular expertise in a particular area, you are really low on the Dunning-Kruger curve on, you know, everything else. So it's really hard to generalize.
That's a really interesting point, yeah.
On each person, right? So that's simply not possible. I think what we've set out to do here is we've identified a gap. Yeah. So, and it's interesting that there is this gap. You know, Cambridge has always been a socially active place. You know, there's a kind of active community and student campaigns and a host of worthy causes, you know, climate change, living wage, refugee welfare, reproductive justice. But given how large misinformation is as a problem, how endemic it is across backgrounds, cultures, you know, socioeconomic status, whatever, like it's, and how intertwined it is with aforementioned problems, it's puzzling. There's nothing dedicated to it. And I think there are two things we need to acknowledge here. One is that pseudoscience misinformation is a very difficult thing to get our heads around, which we touched on. I think there's something inherently confusing about talking about the way science, talking about the science of the way we talk about science. Yeah. I think that puts people off immediately. There's this meta nature. It's very wishy-washy. It's very off-putting. It's, you know, it's not a problem where you kind of see death and suffering and inequality and melting of ice caps. Like these things are very much easier to grasp for people when and kind of discussion and action can kind of be galvanized off using, you know, these things as a more concrete springboard. But this is rather a problem in its own right, which in a way is a precursor to many of those other problems, and that in itself is, it makes it, you know, there is a narrative that needs to come before why people feel they need to care about this.
Yeah.
And then the narrative itself is part of what this is talking about. So you know, there's a lot of cycles in the kind of understanding thing. And then there's a multidisciplinary toolkit. Sorry, yeah, Naomi.
100% agree. Yeah, what I'd like to add to that question is I think for us, or at least what appealed me a lot to this initiative, was the notion that we can only think about what future 10 out of 10s we can avoid from happening, right? And I think it's really important to look at it from a structural and systematic thing where, for instance, as a student, what we see, or what I see from my personal experience, is still like such a problematic culture within academia around the importance of science communication, and also the misconception that the issue lies around scientific literacy being the main problem, right? Whereas so much we know now about the susceptibilities to pseudoscience being very intertwined with many fields of social science and social determinants, and also, of course, maybe especially in Cambridge, which is why I find this such an interesting place, is the very traditional institution that it is, where a lot of times still science communication and outreach is still regarded with like a patronizing way. So obviously within academia itself and other institutions, there's a lot of gap filling that needs to be done. And initially when I thought about tackling pseudoscience, because I come from very like a conservative family that is very much anti-science in certain regards, what I found from personal experience is that indeed you so badly want to convert, so to say, the 10 out of 10s, right? And yeah, you quickly discover that's not helpful at all. So what hopefully is the way to go, and what we hope to do also, as well as students, is to identify within academia, for instance, the places where such gap filling can happen, and also push for this cultural change. And yeah, from a very positive and hopefully well-informed way of what is actually the way forward, which is structural and institutional and systemic change, right? In the narrative around pseudoscience and misinformation. And I believe there's so much to gain still. So yeah.
Absolutely. And the positive is the key of it. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I just think, Naomi, you highlighted, I think, one of the kind of the flaws in skepticism or sort of scientific sort of teaching literacy that sort of was present in the 90s and into the early 2000s, which was like the knowledge deficit model of science communication. The idea that all you need to do is introduce people to the information and they will change their minds. Of course, at the dawn of the internet, when it was a relatively sort of orderly place, it was difficult for people to get websites. The information became available. Did everyone suddenly become deeply scientific? No. And then very quickly, you were able to find websites that confirmed your belief, regardless of how true it was. And so I think that as a model definitely has been sort of discarded by skeptics, and now we're much more on the kind of, I think it was maybe a narrative-based model. You've got people have an internal narrative as to why their facts are true. They have, to an extent, some motivated reasoning, but also they have a story they tell themselves. And in order to change their minds, you have to be able to. You can't just give them the fact. You have to replace the story.
No, absolutely. And I think that plays to the center of what we're about and why we are here. We aren't Cambridge University Student Skeptical Association either. We're not Cambridge University, Students for Science Communication. We're not any of these things. We're keen to be independent to a certain level, and that's and that's because we want to be very careful that even though skepticism is reshaping itself, we want to be able to reach a new group of people, and we want to be able to come out, to be able to say being against pseudoscience is more than, not knowledge deficit model anymore, but more than just critical thinking as well, right? For people to care about this issue, for people to fight this issue, firstly, they need to know the actual harmful effects of misinformation and why they should care, because often, if people understand that they have to care, then there is that drive to do something about it, which is why we consider skeptical associations our allies, because there is huge energy in people who care about these things. It's about thinking broader, different ways to look at these things, as we discussed earlier. And this is something by Inigo, Naomi, and I we've spoken about before. It's not just about knowing what cognitive biases to avoid either. It's not like if I know that people who get things wrong are susceptible to confirmation bias and authoritative bias, it's not that would magically solve everything. It's not like it's more like that these become tools to point out other people's flaws in their thinking more often than not, right? So one thing is to turn these things around into positive thinking habits, just kind of packages of tips that you want to use when you think about these, when you go through your media, etc. But actually, what's even more important is what comes before that. It's actually being very aware of our own psychological motives to believe or disbelieve in entire trust systems in the first place. It's having that discussion in the kind of psychological part of what we're inclined to believe before we talk about the cognitive inoculation, if we like. There are a lot of these things that we just want to make sure being against pseudoscience isn't an us versus them thing. It isn't being against the people who are wrong. It is us adopting a mindset where we are happy to be wrong, to be vulnerable, to make these mistakes, to adopt humility and also compassion for people who get things wrong, and also methods for us to think better in the future.
Right. To add to that compassionate note, I think that's incredibly important, maybe now more than ever, now that I think it cannot be understated how much of if you're not necessarily anti-science, but at the 7 out of 10, right? Maybe vaccine hesitant or something. We shouldn't underestimate how warm and welcoming a community online, at least, there is for those that go to anti-science places. When their alternative is perhaps they're only very cold and maybe condescending encounters with science. So the very fact that now more than ever there's a platform for anti-science thinking to give this warm community makes it ever more important to operate from this principle of compassion, right?
Well, importantly, of course, the vast bulk of believers in pseudoscience are the victims of pseudoscience. They are the ones that are suffering because of their misbelief. And there's probably, I mean, I don't have a figure, but there are probably an incredibly small number of genuinely bad actors that know that what they're peddling isn't true, and they're just trying to turn a profit or gain influence or fame or something. But the vast bulk who, vaccine denial is an example. Obviously, Andrew Wakefield is the most well-known figure. There are some, there are some others, but you're talking a small handful of people that looked, were expecting to benefit from this belief, and millions of people that have suffered from it. And actually, Christopher, to go back to a point that you made earlier, I think that the last 2 years have demonstrated the cost of pseudoscientific belief. Before it was, oh yeah, there's some people that are anti-vax, but they're protected by herd immunity, and okay, there's some people that believe in horoscopes or whatever, but it's harmless. It's not harmless. I think everyone can now agree pretty clearly. Actually, there is some serious harm, surrounding these beliefs. And so,
entire discourses and how they flow. Sorry, Naomi.
Oh no, it was me. I wanted to ask you guys on in the chat. There's been some back and forth about sort of ways of approaching this, what you describe as this inoculation against pseudoscience, and obviously philosophy of science, teaching critical thinking is one approach. I wanted to ask you about a complementary tool in the toolkit, which is statistics and data literacy. And I wanted your perspectives in your Andrew's laughing because this is what Sam and I do. We do stats and data. So they know it's my bias. Yeah. But I'm interested in what your perspectives are about the state of data literacy and statistical literacy of your professional colleagues or the people that you encounter at university. Do you think that level of education is adequate?
So I think I've views on this, and I think firstly, it's appreciating that data literacy is important, but it's only a part of a very multidisciplinary toolkit that actually is required. It's the same as when people think about climate science or public health science. So, there are certain concepts that we want to be out there in the public sphere. And the same applies to misinformation, how people go about their data literacy. The other thing I want to say about data literacy is, before people being familiar with statistics and misrepresentation of data, etc., there is also a crucial discussion to be had about attitudes to uncertainty and risk itself. And this is not entirely the information. It's more what people do after they get the information, which in turn, that action and those effects feed back to the information itself. But I think these things come hand in hand. But the short answer is yes, there is immense value in data literacy. And that is certainly my personal view.
And what about Naomi and Inigo? What have you encountered, even in your personal training or among people that you're seeing? Do you think that And do you feel like anything has been changing recently in that department?
I generally agree with Chris. I mean, I think most people, I do engineering, so I'm around a lot of people that seem to know their stats, not at least they know the math side of it, not that they perhaps understand everything. But on the whole, with those understanding statistics, is much more about knowing how people can use statistics to manipulate you. There's a lot of ways that you can use statistics to misrepresent facts, and I think that's probably, I wouldn't expect anyone to really understand the nitty-gritty of what's going on with the numbers, but as long as you can sort of recognize these I think on the face of it, there's only a couple of techniques most people use to try and use statistics to lie. if you can get those sorts of key concepts down, that can really protect you, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in my personal experience, because I'm in biomathematical modeling, so...
Oh, amazing. Okay, great, cool.
Do
you want a job, by the way? We should talk.
It can be a very frustrating field, though. But what I think, in terms of culture change, especially coming from a modeler's perspective, is, well, at least what I see in my own lab is increasing awareness about how much p-hacking is becoming a problem. And as we speak, like, the funding landscape is fragmenting for science, which increases the pressure for people to not only worry about their science, but also applications for funding. Now, I personally see how much time goes into that. Paired with that is that there's increasing competition for these more fragmented funding scapes. So people feel more pressure to publish. And I feel like what has been really important is my PI constantly reminding us, like, hey, it's about the quality of science. I understand we're under a lot of pressure. I understand it's a very competitive field. But he prefers the long haul over short gains. And I think that's a very important thing to be reminded of, not only for, like, the mental health aspect of our lab, but a very real realization that p-hacking is becoming an increasing problem, no matter how prestigious your institution. And I'm really glad that we're reminded of that. Yeah.
And also, I think we should acknowledge that in order to be able to take that view scientifically, you need to come from a position of safety and therefore relative privilege, of knowing that you're not applying for your job for the next 6 months on the basis of work that you're trying to publish today. And that's part of the problem with the way that academia is currently set up, is it's set up to incentivize false positives.
Well, any positives.
Any positives. Yeah, that's true. And so just briefly, p-hacking, for those of you who don't know, is the tendency to discover things that are statistically significant when they're not. And I think the term can encompass both sort of like intentional misuse or unintentional misuse of statistics, as well as sort of psychological factors that end up with people setting up experiments poorly in a way that, even if you do the stats right, will give you a misleading result. It's a fairly complex problem. And one thing that those of you who are students might not be aware is, like, the reason why Sam and I were like, yay, p-hacking, is because in our professional jobs, so we both work in management for tech companies. I work in e-commerce. Sam works in fintech. And we talk about this a lot at work, not to a lot of people who appreciate it. Like my data scientist, my data analyst do, but we talk about it a lot. And it's for me, it's that's why I think that kind of data literacy and statistics is really fundamental, because it's about deciding which drugs are going to cure which cancer. It's also about, but the people making that decision are a very small number of people. And in some ways we can outsource that expertise. But when it comes to making decisions every single day about which product we're going to try to sell, or which decision we should make in business, suddenly there's a way higher percentage of the population trying to make those decisions.
Yeah, and often they're just, it is just a lack of statistical understanding. So if for example we're running a test on, we've got, in Erica's world, we've got version A of a journey, we've got version B of a journey, which one works better? And you're running a test at 95% confidence intervals, significance, then actually you run the test, it's inconclusive. Okay, you wait a couple more days, you do the analysis again. By the time you've done that 10 times, your likelihood of getting a wrong answer isn't 5%, it's 40%.
But instead, what we do is we do the math a little differently so that we can stop early in our case. But that's
for only correction for the win.
But yeah, that's a more complicated. But that's a detail that we have to convey to people, or that we have to make sure is done behind the scenes and communicated.
And linking to that, I think this also links back to some major problems currently existing within academia and the culture of academia, that with this increasing pressure to publish, which not only leads to more p-hacking, it also leads to those active in the scientific community have less time and less priority for actually communicating their science or thinking about engaging with local communities about their science or research or involving them in any way. So I think overall, this like recent culture change in academia, relatively recent, is hurting us in multiple fronts. Which is part of the reason why I think it's so important that that is addressed. And the hard thing about this is that it's really hard to see who has the power to possibly change these things. And obviously, in a bigger scheme of things, a lot of our research is published by the public, right? And if we're lucky, we live in a democracy. So having the public appreciate and understanding for science will hopefully translate in, I don't know, people or parties being voted in that actually want to spend more of their GDP or the country's GDP on science, right? So in the bigger scheme of things, I'm very scared about how much the funding landscape is fragmenting and the side effects of that. And yeah, for the legitimacy of science to uphold itself in the very present and real phenomenon of p-hacking, having that overall baseline of increased data literacy is of course very important.
And I think, I was going to say, I think I'm the only person here that can speak to that position that you're talking about, which is that academic publishing mindset, because that is what I did before I left and went down the data science route. And my field was actually archaeology, which has nothing to do with data science. So it was a bit different. Obviously, like my research was very quantitative, which is how I ended up where I am. And I think like we could have a whole, like, we could break out some beers and like have a real heart-to-heart on this anytime. I think maybe like the more positive and less niche way to have this conversation right now is to ask you, you know, do you feel like giving support for research students at that stage in their career is something that's within your remit? Within what you guys are doing in your organization, is that a topic that's coming up?
Chris?
Hello, sorry, there was something that just came in. Sorry, what did I miss? Literally last.
So I was wondering about the idea of kind of the pressure that research students are facing to publish and the pressures that they face both to potentially compromise their scientific and pseudoscientific integrity, but also the pressure that they face to maybe not do a good job standing up for science in their spare time because they don't have the time pressure. Is that something that you've encountered through your work in the society? Is that a theme that you see at all?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I think there is so much pressure to perform in the traditional systematic structures of what it means to succeed in science that is actually quite difficult to break out of that mindset and stand up for the integrity of science outside of your academic pressures. That, you know, be it at the high level discussion you've just had, or the more simple things that we're trying to do, which is things like critical thinking workshops and how to communicate what you know at the level you already know. This will always be a problem, but that is why we need to get as large a community as we can within academia to at least start thinking about these issues, because it does ring personal to most people.
And for me, when I was doing my PhD, and this was like 15 to 12 years ago, like knowing like being able to explore potential like alternative uses of my scientific skills were really important to me. And obviously, like, as it turns out, like I'm real good at talking and I don't do research anymore. So clearly, like, exploring aspects of science communication was really useful for me at that stage. So like I would hope for you guys that one of the ways that you can attract students is by kind of saying to them, like, there are multiple pathways from your degree onwards, and you might want to explore these skills because they might lead you somewhere.
Absolutely. That part of what we do, yes, it is. You know, there is the building community part. There is the there is the part of this which is a cause, a campaign part of this, but there is very much the empowering future scientists and leaders with skills also for them to diversify the kind of things that they might do in a kind of social progression mindset. The interesting thing about us being a cause is that we aren't, it's hard to say that we are radical in any way. If anything, we are just really firmly pragmatic. And that's actually quite, yeah, it's actually a really good place to be. Yeah.
So,
oh no, I was just going to say, sort of, Naomi, you've hit on the kind of the academic pressures around the actual science that's being done. But then, of course, you mentioned actually, what most of this is communicated, published by the public, and so quite often academic research is done by an academic. They, there may be press releases. They'll speak to journalists, but actually, it's the journalists that are writing up the report. And the joke comes to mind. A scientist is speaking to a journalist, and he says, all of my discoveries are meaningless if taken out of context. And the journalist comes around and goes, scientific discoveries are meaningless. And so,
thank you for laughing at the joke.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to be a dad soon, so I'm just
he's practicing. Yeah.
But that's, journalists these days often have a lot of pressure to publish more and more frequently. They maybe have less time to understand the material to an extent. So aside from teaching, I suppose, the scientific method and sort of the scientific toolkit to academics, I think we also similarly need the same thing for journalists. Like, should there be a scientific literacy requirement in, say, journalism degrees?
Well, we all know that journalism is such a cushy field these days. I think we can just lob more things in there. Why not, right?
So, Paul Offit, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, I hadn't actually viewed it from that perspective yet. And I think, again, if you look at it from a meta level, the demand for this fast information turnover is, of course, feeding this style of journalism as well, right? And I think as soon as we have this overall culture change in society where the baseline level of critical thinking and media literacy is as such that the demand for such media is also lower, then I would expect that journalists would also have this lower pressure to have this fast information turnover and therefore miss the nuance that is often so important in scientific reporting, right?
Yeah, I think Paul Offit spoke to us directly on this point last year, and that's very much that he talks a lot about vaccines in US media, and we all know that's a bit of a firefighting kind of situation. But yeah, if scientists aren't getting their voices heard, then it is down to journalism to define what is interpreted by the public. The answer to this, the way I see it, is threefold. One is, as you say, a degree of statistic or scientific literacy amongst journalists. And actually, when we got NewsGuard to speak to us a few weeks ago, we got a very good sense that this is actually not unrealistic. It's not necessarily specific scientific training either. It's actually just good professionalism in the way you fact check things, and it's about who you ask if you don't have those skills yourself, and to what extent do you bother to go to check that those things are right. And we see a lot of forces out there trying to get fact checking and associated skills widely accessible in media. The second part of this is raising scientists who in the future are not afraid to put their voices out there. It's very, we of course, there is always the issue of, scientists can only talk about things in a very uncertain way, like there's the nature of different roles of politicians and scientists, and they can claim things to different effects. But there is great value in a scientist saying something in public being able to take ownership of their own work, being able to communicate their own findings. But that takes us to the third part of this issue, which is the public itself. And of course, the onus of getting things wrong is not on the individual members of the public. But if people, if there are ways for people to get their heads around not only what we traditionally mean by data literacy and media literacy, but also things like science changes, things develop, narratives develop. It's okay for things to have been taken to be right and then are not right anymore. Things like that, that's part of these. People disagree on what scientific literacy means, but if it does involve something that everyone should know, it's very much these very helpful concepts. Because it then means that people don't lose trust over very normal parts of how not just how science works, but how scientific information travels.
I think one potential limitation of this theme, which is about sort of scientists being empowered to communicate science, is that on its own, it can potentially lead to the assumption that the burden of combating pseudoscience is on scientists, and it is other people's job. Like other people are just supposed to receive that wisdom. Your organization is not called Scientists Against Pseudoscience. It's called Students Against Pseudoscience. And I wondered what things do you find yourselves doing, or do you plan to do to break down that wall to be more accessible to non-scientists?
That's a great question.
Thanks. I say that as a fellow, as a former non-scientist.
No, that's great. So firstly, when I say the onus is not on members of the public, it doesn't necessarily then mean it's on scientists themselves. Yes, scientists have a responsibility, but I think there are plenty of systematic systems at play here. So it's anything to do with policy, from education to tech to the amount of scientism in the system itself, to how communities are marginalized, and how that means that those communities then become more and more susceptible as a vicious cycle. There are a lot of things to be done that does not fall on scientists, and even as communicators, they're not all scientists, are they? We've talked about journalists, we've talked about politicians. This is a burden that is shared across the sectors, which is why when we take things back down to the students level, we're looking ahead to these people filling those spaces in the future. We do need to reach laterally. And you're right, students against pseudoscience, it puts people, the against bit puts people off because at first they think it's an us versus them kind of affair, and the pseudoscience bit puts people off because they see the word science and they go, oh, actually this isn't for me. But also it's actually quite key that we maintain this focus, because otherwise we then just become about conspiracies and misinformation in general, and then we get dragged into political science, and then we lose the focus on that as well. So what we actually just try to do to reach across is to define what we do by the work we do. So we are slowly trying to push our workshops out, and once we have that workshop, and once the blueprint of our content is firm, then we can have more social media items out there. All of this knowledge is already out there, by skeptics, by psychologists, by people across all sorts of fields. It's really about repackaging them into a series of learning objectives that is applicable to people across the board, and also repackaging them into a kind of tone that is friendly and understanding of people who just simply think differently because of the trust system they've grown up in or born under. So,
although you are saying they, not us.
It is. Well,
it still sounds like the people that you're trying to reach aren't part of your group yet.
No, so that is true to an extent, because in many ways we have been those people in the past, and there are things that this will always be this line will always, in some sense, be across ourselves in a certain
well,
way, because there will always be areas we are.
I'm not trying to like catch a difficult question. Like
no.
Like maybe just going to suggest that one way to reach people who feel like they have no enfranchisement with science right now is maybe to go with sort of like adjacent disciplines and kind of test your waters there. And this is like coming from my archaeology background, is like there's a lot of like tribalism in terms of how people approach their early career disciplines. And there's a lot of sense of like, and you guys were already mentioning it in terms of like how people feel about when they're drawn to pseudoscientific communities. People feel that same community involvement with their academic disciplines. And I think that it's really helpful to have ambassadors who are adjacent or in that situation to be able to speak to people authentically about the situation. So although my discipline was not classified as STEM, it was very scientific, and and that was sort of what drew me into skepticism. And like Andrew's discipline doesn't like always get counted as a science, but psychology is very scientific. And so I think there are those adjacent disciplines that you can go to and then kind of meet people who bridge that gap, and find your way further and further to the people who are like studying like abstract art, which I cannot like comprehend an appreciation of, but who are important people to talk to.
Right. And I think one of our major goals is within the student community, and why we are calling ourselves like Students Against Pseudoscience, and the power there is within actually catering to the student community, is, at least from my personal perspective, I will be so happy if we can get the young people involved in this line of thinking and discussion, to make students not only have like a negative association possibly with their ideas of what fighting pseudoscience is, which is most of the time, as it was for me at least, arguing with uncles on Facebook. Instead, we're going to show you, or hopefully show to the students, it is actually something else. Yeah. And also, one major goal is to actually be very welcoming and open our arms to all humanities people. Like, we need you. And
like, because there are students who are in through their disciplines who are, being exposed to the idea that there is no truth. Truth is relative, and those are useful frameworks for interpreting their fields.
Well, that's your opinion.
But and so how do you approach someone who is really gung-ho on working with these new ideas for the first time, and you want to say, well, actually, like, sorry, no, you're wrong, and please vaccinate yourself. It's a fascinating. Being at a university is a wonderful opportunity to be exposed to such a cross section of people.
Absolutely, and that is very fascinating. And we get all sorts of first impressions when people come and talk to us, and it's really useful to hear what they have to say before explaining to them what it is that we believe. And for example, for the example that you've raised, which is for people for which the idea of truth being relative, or the idea for which the discussion of pseudoscience is very much on the epistemological level, it's actually not very difficult for us to say, well, the harmful effects of vaccine hesitancy and climate change denial, and all of these things are there for us to see. And while we can talk about the philosophical part of this issue, it's clear that what we're trying to do here is all of this stuff that is inherently difficult to think about, but it doesn't take any value out of the need to at least, if not take action, then discuss frameworks to understand them, or ways for different sectors to come together to deal with them. In any case, us being here is us being exposed to all sorts of mindsets for academic reasons, for cultural reasons, that people think and experience this issue. It means we can actually bring different academics together, and it means we can link these academics to to representatives from sectors who we hear from, and also who we hope to be able to reach out through a more local community network, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have a question related to that. A lot of times you encounter people who are basically like, but science is hard. The alternate explanations are easier to understand. I don't understand all the physics and chemistry in that, but I understand that this is a tradition in China of putting herbs in my tea and it'll make me feel better. And so that's what I do. How do you approach people who basically find science off-putting? That they look for answers in other fields, in other areas. They understand what we're calling pseudoscience side of things, but the science is beyond them.
So I think this is difficult, but a big part of it actually is genuinely being empathetic. I think the example that you raised is one that is close to me, and I think sometimes we can remember that there are innocuous uses of pseudoscience and traditions and superstitions, and sometimes those are okay, as long as when it comes to this person needing genuine healthcare help, that we want them to be able to be exposed to a community and medical experts who are patient with them, empathetic with them, and happy to break things down to the level that, to the bits of information that they need to make their decisions. And that's something that the NHS talks about a lot in the way we talk to patients but I think what isn't talked about enough is, from the science and medical professional point of view, is information that is received outside of the doctor-patient relationship, outside of the teacher-student relationship. Those structures of traditions and religions and cultures that actually do form a part of people's identities. Even when when we think about public health messaging, it's very easy to forget the many communities where WhatsApp forwarding is the main part of their information grasp, or where there are implicit cultural norms which are very much part of why they've interpreted certain information in the first place. I think all of this is a big part of what a big part of the discussion that I would hope to be able to see in the next 5 to 10 years.
It's funny. I once had a discussion with someone at work who is relatively senior, and we were chatting about just friendly stuff, and this person mentioned like a particular home remedy from their culture that they were consuming, and I think they even recommended it to me. They were like, oh, like if you're feeling this, like make sure you have this. And I was like, okay, so that our company's experimentation team, like what we do is making like judgments off of statistics, and the same like decisions that you are helping and like you are like supporting people to sign off on based on statistics, that same math proves that this has no positive effect. And I was like friendly with this person at the time, like, so it wasn't like I didn't get fired or anything. But like I was like, it is really awesome if you do this, home remedy because you find it comforting or whatever. But like, how can you support the math on this side but not on that side?
Yeah.
Right. I think also a part of the question is, or in my anecdotal experience is, that having this humble position as a scientist and really being like more open about that science is indeed a malleable process, basically, right? It's not this end all be all perfect entity. And I also think helping people to understand that the scientific method is often very different from the scientific institution, right? So oftentimes when I talk to people about this, when they're like, science is so daunting, I will never get it, I'm not good at math or whatever, they might say, I think it helps to bring that notion like, you don't need to be great at math. Like there's plenty of scientists that apply the scientific methods that are horrible at arithmetic, including myself. Really having that humbling attitude when you start these conversations. And I really think that, for instance, like at great things like a science festival or something where we also aim to make science more accessible to people, having that added element, not only of like almost showing like, oh, this is the great science we produce, which can still in some sense be intimidating to people, also have a really real element about the openness, the trial and error that is involved, the malleability, the humility, the human aspect of science, being very open and transparent about that will hopefully make it less of a binary thing for people where it's like science capitalized versus me, maybe. So yeah, again, I think that humble perspective is so integral in actually getting these people to be excited about science and not scared off.
I think you're spot on there. Yeah, I think
the
other. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry. What I was going to say is the other part of what Erica said is that, you know, as representatives of any course, actually, you don't really need to achieve that ideological purity. You know, not everyone has to live 100% to what they, you know, if that's part of their culture, if that's, you know, I think there is room for that cognitive dissonance as long as they're aware of it. You know, I think I'm not going to police every interaction I have because I stand, you know, as a president of this course. I feel like people often come up to me and ask me, oh, is this pseudoscience? What are you going to think of me if I believe this? And I was like, I don't care. Yeah, it's really okay.
Like being generous, like both with yourself and others, is probably a really important mechanism by which your group can feel more inclusive.
It's a big part of this, and you know, it's something we believe in. Yeah. And Sam, you were going to say something as well.
Yeah. I was just going to add. I think that the humble and generous approach is absolutely spot on as the standard approach. It is, however, vulnerable to bad actors. So in my work, I've worked with people, not usually in my company, usually in other companies, but you know, people who are deeply self-motivated, who are more than happy to misrepresent the facts, who are fully aware of what they're doing. And a humble approach is fine for your opening salvo, but when they come back and go, nope, I know what it is, it doesn't really work. You end up, you know, when you're meeting, you know, I'm going to call them a Trumpster, someone who is like Trump, who has a Trump-like lack of knowledge of something, and yet ridiculous overconfidence, apparent overconfidence.
He was
no, I'm not gesturing at you. I'm just.
No, that's a very good point.
I'm Canadian, by the way.
That kind of really strong bad faith argument can only be met by a similarly robust response, because otherwise, you know, there is a massive issue of people believing people who are confident, and the problem is that scientists and, generally speaking, sort of more intelligent people are generally more full of doubt because they know that actually there's weaknesses in this founding element, or they're aware of the nuance. Whereas actually, if you're ignorant, it's very easy to be very confident.
Dunning-Kruger plus an understanding of stats means you're never going to be certain about anything.
No, but on the other hand, if that approach is taken to everything, that put people off itself, you know, off these healthy attitudes and stuff. So
I think when you're on the other side of the Dunning-Kruger effect, you can actually start to have conversations with, it doesn't matter whether I'm sure about X. The question is whether I'm sure that X is a lower risk than Y. And it's interesting because I'm like, I see a lot of pseudoscience around like specific medical decisions in my life right now, and it's like, oh, is this procedure safe? I don't know. And it's like, it doesn't, like, we can't tell you whether it's safe. All we can tell you is that it's safer than X.
Well, and that's the whole question around some of the vaccine stuff. You know, when the questions around the like AstraZeneca blood clots came out, the question, we were being asked, oh yeah, but the vaccine could give you a blood clot, and he's like, yeah, but the likelihood of it giving you a blood clot is significantly lower than likelihood of you dying from COVID without the vaccine. Like, in terms of like the accumulated risk of taking the vaccine versus the accumulated risk of not taking the vaccine, it's an absolute no-brainer.
And we see a lot of communication, on online, and that makes these things very easily digestible and understood for people. And we really like to see more of those. But what I was about to say with what you said earlier, which I'm about to completely forget, is
Chris, sorry. In the meantime, while you think, can I also ask you guys a question?
Sorry. Yep.
Obviously, having been an organization in Cambridge for a while, I'm curious about how you view the university's possible role and infrastructure in fighting pseudoscience and skeptical thinking. Whether you feel like there's a change in there. Just in general, because I'm a little bit cynical about this, so don't let that taint your answer. I'm just curious about how you view this as having been here as a skeptical community, basically independent from the university for a while.
I mean, I personally haven't been here all that long. I think Andrew and Dave will be able to give the best answer to that. But for me, the fact that the university is home to the public understanding of risk department,
the Winston Center,
yeah, obviously that's an enormously important department, center, whatever, group of people. Without a sort of concentrated group to try and understand that, actually, it would make things an awful lot more difficult. But that, of course, is affecting more at a national level rather than a Cambridge level.
Dave, do you have anything to say? Go on.
You've been here much longer than me. I'll let you take this one.
Oh, goodness sake. Right. So, I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I feel that maybe I've been in something of a bubble, in that, I hang out with skeptics. When I went to university, I did psychology, where they talk about biases and cognitive dissonance and, the ways we can misunderstand things and how there's flaws in our thinking and stuff. And so I spent a lot of time with people who understood that, you have to think critically about things. You have to analyze the way you're approaching things. At the same time, I grew up in a Christian background, and I have friends who are young Earth creationists and things like that. I remember my very first day at my current job. One of the managers walks into the office going, "I think I took a picture of a UFO last night," and I literally had to bite my knuckles not to just go, So it's difficult to say. I am surprisingly a little bit positive in this area. I think that younger generations and people who are going through university at the moment have better understanding of science. They have a better a view of the importance of taking an active role in the world, of trying to make things better, of not leaving it to the older generations to do things. And I think that's all a good thing. I think that we are moving in a direction where science, even if people don't understand science, they understand it's important. They understand that, it's critical to how the world works, that we are facing big problems like climate change, like the pandemic and things like that, and that science is the answer. They don't. I think Naomi did a brilliant job of describing about the scientific method, and I think that even if you don't understand, how the science of a vaccine works, which I don't, but if you understand that the approach taken, the scientific approach of, looking at the problem, raising a question, working out a way to test that question, analyzing the evidence, and then going, okay, we were wrong, let's ask a new question. So and working your way through that, I think if you can understand that, you can understand that science is a important way of progressing towards correct answers. I have gone completely off on a tangent to the question I was actually asked, which is a tendency I have to, but I am quite confident, and I'm going to hand over to Dave, who teaches critical thinking at school. So
critical thinking.
Critical stinking, yes, critical thinking.
The Scott says critical stinking. Oh my
critical
god.
Stinking, yes.
Dave,
save me.
I hope none of my students are watching.
Don't worry, nobody's watching, so it's okay.
Thank God for that. So the question was about the role of the university and Cambridge Skeptics, and obviously, Andrew, you've been here since the beginning, and we were a university society at one point, I believe.
Okay.
So what has the connection between the university and Cambridge Skeptics been like over the time you've been with the group, Andrew?
Oh, goodness. So I did come into Cambridge Skeptics fairly early, and yes, I think the people who ran it initially were connected with the university and stuff like that. We did sort of start as part of the Skeptics in the Pub thing, which is a much wider group, and so I don't know if necessarily the connection to the university was that strong from the beginning. It was more of talking about critical thinking, having talks on science and things like that in a pub environment, getting an interaction with the public. It was, come along, have a drink and learn about quantum physics over your beer. So it was that sort of thing. I'll be honest.
Certainly, when I joined, there was very much desire to separate ourselves from the university.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. My experience is it's not the connection with the university from Cambridge Skeptics hasn't been that strong. As I think Erica said earlier, we've very much been, the university does their side of it, but for the general public, there's our side of it. And so, I'm very keen to make a stronger connection between us. I think that would be good. But I think Cambridge Skeptics has always, Cambridge Skeptics in the Pub, as it was to start with, has always aimed to bring science, critical thinking, that sort of thing to the general public, rather than the university side of it, which already has.
I always got the impression that there was a fear that if we got too embedded with the university, that would scare off the town.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
That makes perfect sense. And I think that's why having this kind of two-pronged approach is actually really the best way to go about it.
Because honestly, even just a lot of the university facilities, if you're oh yeah, our talk is in this room at St. John's, a person who is not indoctrinated into the university, just physically navigating those logistics is very intimidating. There's a literal
it's very difficult.
You have to go through with a guard in order to go to the thing, and then you just wander around lost, and people look at you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And also we. Sorry.
So Sam's is there past trauma you want to talk about?
Yeah, and also we're ultimately looking at empowering future professionals and thinking about policy and that kind of stuff as well. And there are the different levels of work at play here. And apart from this parallel approach, I want to go back to what Sam said earlier, and I think there is also that parallel approach of that there is always a need for skeptics, for people firmly defending science against active disinformation spreaders. That will always be needed. But what we're promoting here, and there's a reason why we're students, there's a reason why we're doing this in the UK, is that we can actually grow this kind of movement from this level, which makes a lot of sense, because currently what dominates that discussion in misinformation is very much the other branch. So any voice and any power that we can boost this branch with really is what we need. So I think all in all, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, what I've always...
I'll pass back to Andrew. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's, we're going to start wrapping up soon. So I think we get some final thoughts in. Erica is chomping at the bit there to say something, so I'll hand over to her to finish off.
I was just going to say that what I've always thought is, your question was, what does the university owe the public in terms of fighting pseudoscience? That's a really big philosophical question, and I think it touches on themes about what is the purpose of a university in the 21st century. Those are really big ideas that I'm not going to go into. I think that maybe instead we want to frame the question as like, what do we want to do? What's in our power to do together? And I've always believed that, that I think that the university has, and like I speak this not knowing Cambridge specifically, but knowing a very similar university quite well, that like there are so many great things that the university can do, great systems in place, great people, great networks. It does take insider knowledge to be able to navigate that. And at the same time, students are in a special place in their lives. They're not, they're not having access to the sorts of things that people outside of the university have necessarily. So I think a way that I would really love to work together is as a partnership in taking the biggest advantage we can of each of our networks and aligning on the topics that we are mutually interested in.
100%.
Awesome. So,
absolutely, yes, please.
Chris, Inigo, and Naomi, do you have anything you want to say to finish off, and then we'll wrap up for the evening?
Yeah, join the movement. It's fun.
What should people do if they want to join? What are your instructions for anyone that's listening?
Join our mailing list.
Yeah.
Follow our social media. We'll keep you updated.
We'll put all that in the
link to your website
downstairs.
In the chat. It'll be in the description. And like in terms of students who might be coming across this video, like maybe at the end of term or in a different term, is there can they just come and reach out anytime?
Yeah. Anytime.
They don't have to wait till Freshers Week or whatever. They can do it anytime.
No, they can do it anytime. Absolutely. And the other thing I would say is you are all lovely people, and I feel like we should talk again soon.
We really should.
For us to talk about.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right. So
Thank you.
that was a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed that. So on the subject of pseudoscience and things like that, next time we will be having a talk on the rise of QAnon from a chap whose name I'm not going to attempt to butcher, but he also goes by the name of Jared, which I can say. So all please tune in next time on the 15th of March for that. It should prove to be a very interesting topic. And thank you again very much to Students Against Pseudoscience. It was lovely having you here. I very much enjoyed talking with you all. And good night to everybody, and see you next time.
Cheers.
Good night. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.